subject matter. That would be either analytically or somehow comparatively. And the approach has both its positive sides, no doubt. Nevertheless, I have to disappoint both of these expectations. If one wants to remain, in any sense, faithful, however minimally, to Žižek's philosophy, one has somehow to begin, as it were, in the middle, and then go along, try to make sense of these terms from our own concrete situations. So the best way to approach Žižek's philosophy would be, I believe, is similar to the way we begin to learn a new language. Although we usually start with the alphabet and simple syntactical rules, the real process of learning a new language can be said to begin not with formal definitions, which as abstractions are usually useless, but only when we are thrown in situations which demand that we master the use of words in concrete situations, and I underline the word concrete, by finding the relevant words, the relevant connections, and the meanings that these words convey in concrete situations. So I have already introduced the word concrete, and we will introduce also its cognate concretely. This is a very relevant word for Žižek, for he often speaks, as Anders explains, of concrete universality. But to answer the question of what is concrete universality is already to engage in abstractions, which, while may give us formal definition, will nevertheless convey an imprecise use of the conjunction concrete universal. Why is this so? Because concrete is already universal. A universal thought that has found a body. It is this body, this concrete element, which serves to ground the abstract universal, and the universal as such is always abstract, and thus empty, which keeps the universal from becoming. But becoming what? What is it that prevents the body of the universal from becoming universal? In other words, what it is that the universal cannot become. It cannot become precisely universal. Universal cannot become universal. This is prohibited basically by the thesis of the non-coincidence of a thing with itself, the ontological incompleteness of reality itself. The reason why the universal cannot attain a universal status, one probably would say an absolute status, is because, and this is very paradoxical, I realize it's very paradoxical, but apparently one of the definitions of philosophy is precisely, as opposed to the sophist, is to expose paradoxes and remain at that, with the hope that nobody will notice your own paradoxical position. The reason why the universal cannot attain a universal status is because the universal is always already colored by the particular. Nay, it is always already particular in itself. The void which universality effectively is not only filled in with particular content, but that the particular content is indispensable to the existence of the formal universality. It is generated out of the void of the universal, or as Žižek likes to put it, out of the crack in the universal, out of the need of the universal to become particular. They can be separated as abstractions in thought, but beyond that, concretely, there are two sides of the same coin. Already here we have a definition of the dialectic relation of the universal and the particular via a third element, the singular, or the individual. The individual is still particular and contingent, but it is particular which stands out from the chain of equivalences of other particulars, as one of its elements, signifiers, by virtue of representing, embodying, taking over, hegemonizing, standing in, whatever you want to put there, standing in for the empty universality. More concretely, the universal generates or gives birth to the particular from within the crack in itself. But equally, its opposite claim holds true as well. The concrete generates the universal from within itself, from the non-coincidence of itself with itself. So that's the paradox of the universal and the particular. So the dialectical relation, basically what it does is to bring forth the paradox and leave it at that. So there is no genesis to the universal. We do not know what came first, who gave birth to which. We only know them as synchronous, as necessitating each other. For the alternative is purely destructive. A particular which pretends to speak without support in the universal, in that which is addressed to all. Universal is basically that which is addressed to all in this minimal definition, which is addressed to all equally, of course, is self-annihilating and irrational, regardless of how we understand. A particular which doesn't find its support in a universal, basically, it's self-destructive. In political terms, this would lead to fascism and all forms of brutal domination. It cannot justify its own existence from within itself without encountering itself, first itself as an obstacle, and then another, which basically resists such claims. A universal, on the other hand, which purports to remain aloof of its particular content, is clearly a false universal, a universal that cannot find its appropriate concrete, the support in a body. So the relation between the two is not the relation of a genus and its species, or concrete subsumed under a general name, which immediately establishes also and betrays a certain hierarchy in thought and forms of social domination. A true universal is that which finds itself in the particular, not reflected in the particular, but as one of the particulars, while still retaining of its power of disengagement from the concrete particular when it no longer fits the notion. The minimal difference has still to be there. So the universal and the particular are thus codependent terms. In other words, one can only be truly universal when one fully grounded in a particular. One can only participate in a universal reason, in a universal norm, by binding herself in that which embodies and grounds the universal. There is no universal like existing out of above differences and particularities and contingencies. There is such thing as pure false universal. This, moreover, is not merely optional, something that we can put aside and float, as it were, above the particular contingencies. Contingency is necessary for the universal. A Norwegian person can only be universal, can only live in accordance with and participate in the universal by recognizing the universal in here and now, in the very form and modality of her existence. This is generally right, for as I already mentioned, a particular which is not grounded in some universal has a short span of life. It is self-destructive. Pure particularities don't exist. All particularities, like all universalities, are basically impure, not in the sense of dirty, of course. Nonetheless, we cannot fail to see that the relation is somehow forced. The particular seems to be arbitrarily chosen. Or is it so? Is there a necessary connection between the universal and this particular, this concrete particular, to be more precise? Can any particular function as universal? The dialectic logic has certain necessity to it. For if it is true that the universal and the particular generate each other more or less simultaneously, that the concrete, out of certain necessity or desire for recuperation or any other socially valid reason from within itself generates the universal as an aspiration, as an idea or as an ideal, and that the universal in search for a particular, in the transformation from being to becoming itself, generates the concrete, to use the Benedict Anderson's famous words, invents a tradition,